I had just turned 18, and everything seemed to be aligning perfectly for a new chapter in my life. My dad had promised me a special trip to India, a dream we'd shared for so long. The significance of this journey was more than just a vacation. It was a deep, emotional connection to the memories of my late mother. We had always bonded over Indian films, colorful, lively stories that brought us joy and a sense of comfort. My mom, who passed away when I was just 6, had adored Indian cinema too. She owned a small collection of movies, though she'd never been to India. It was her lifelong dream, one she and my dad had promised to fulfill until tragedy struck. My mother passed away suddenly from a brain aneurysm while she slept, just before my dad could find the means to take us on that long-awaited trip to India. It left a hole in all of us, especially my dad, who had lost his childhood sweetheart. The grief was crushing, but in the midst of it, my dad and I found solace in those movies. It became a ritual for us. Every week, we'd sit together, watching a film from my mom's collection, as a way to keep her memory alive. Those moments formed the heart of our bond, and as time passed, they became the foundation of my relationship with my dad. I knew my mother would be proud of us, watching from wherever she was, knowing we kept that connection strong. India had always lived in our hearts as something more than just a destination. It was a place tied to memories of my mother, a promise that, until now, we could never fulfill. Time and money had always stood in our way. But on my 18th birthday, everything changed. My dad, with a smile, told me we were finally going to make it happen. My heart soared. We were going to India, just the two of us. The best part? My stepmom and stepsister wouldn't be coming with us. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence that the timing worked out this way. My stepsister, Nadia, had finals, and my stepmom, Susan, had a major project at work. But deep down, I had a feeling my dad had planned it this way, making sure it was just the two of us. I wasn't particularly close to them, and the thought of going on a trip with them sounded more like a nightmare than a dream. When my dad surprised me with the news during my birthday party, everyone was overjoyed, except for Susan and Nadia. The tension was palpable. Their faces told the story, disappointment written all over them. It was clear they didn't like the idea of me getting this trip, and it stung. After the party, when everyone had left, I overheard my dad arguing with Susan. I couldn't catch every word, but it was obvious she didn't agree with him surprising me with this trip. She thought he should have postponed it, waited for the whole family to go together. But I was relieved it wasn't happening that way. The last thing I wanted was for this trip, which meant so much to me, to be tainted by their presence. Susan and Nadia were difficult to travel with. I'd been on trips with them before, and it was always filled with tension. They just weren't the right people for a journey that was so deeply personal to me. It wasn't about not wanting them there out of spite, it was about preserving the sanctity of the moment, the memories of my mom, and the dream that was finally coming true. My dad had his reasons for not inviting them, too. Susan had work commitments, and Nadia had her high school finals, with graduation just around the corner. They wouldn't have been able to come even if they wanted to. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this timing wasn't purely coincidental. My dad knew how much this trip meant to me, and the last thing I wanted was for it to turn into a family vacation that I'd regret. Susan and Nadia had only come into our lives about 5 years ago, and for a while, everything was fine. They seemed friendly enough, but when my dad married Susan 2 years ago, everything shifted. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when things went wrong, but after they married, Susan and Nadia changed. Suddenly, they began acting distant, cold, as if they had issues with me that had never been there before. I had never been close to either of them, but at least we used to get along. Now, things were different. The relationship I had once had with them was fading, and I was left with the painful realization that this trip was the one thing I had left to make it right in my own way. Before the marriage, we had a cordial relationship, a balance of respect and distance. But once they tied the knot, everything changed. Susan began to treat me with cruelty, like I was an inconvenience to her new life. Nadia, her daughter, quickly followed her mother's lead. They would speak to me with such disdain, with the kind of harshness that cuts deep. What made it worse was how they'd reserved this venom for when my dad wasn't around. Whenever he entered the room, their tone would shift, and they'd pretend everything was fine. It felt like a game, one I wasn't willing to play. So, I decided to confront them. I had a recording, one where they'd been especially mean to me just days before. I didn't plan it, but it proved to be my saving grace. When we had a family meeting, their initial denial crumbled under the weight of the evidence. They couldn't lie their way out of it. At first, they tried to twist the narrative. Susan and Nadia put on the tears, claiming they felt rejected, like I hadn't accepted them as family. But that wasn't true. I had considered them family. What they were doing wasn't about family, it was about their own insecurities, and I couldn't help but see that. And then my dad, caught between wanting peace and trying to hold on to his new relationship, asked us all to try. I understood. He was just trying to make it work. He'd been alone for so long after my mom's passing, and Susan was the first woman he had really connected with since then. I didn't want to destroy that for him. So, for his sake, I decided to hold my peace. But after that, things didn't improve, they just shifted. Instead of pretending to be nice to me in front of my dad, they ignored me entirely when he wasn't around. At first, it stung. But then I realized maybe this was the best I could hope for. They weren't being cruel, just indifferent. And I could handle indifference. So, for the past year, we played the part of a happy family, at least when my father was watching. The strange part was I never understood why they changed their attitude towards me. I hadn't done anything. Maybe it was just their nature. But what they did recently, it confirmed everything I'd suspected. 3 days ago, after my birthday, I spoke to my dad at breakfast. I needed answers. I had overheard Susan and Nadia venting the night before about not being included in the trip. They were upset, but I wasn't surprised. My dad understood our rocky relationship and wanted this trip to be special, just for the two of us. After all, it was close to my mom's death anniversary, and this trip to India was as much about honoring her as it was about fulfilling a dream we both shared. But the biggest reason I was thrilled? After years of dealing with Susan and Nadia on vacations, I knew how difficult they could be. My dad and I were adventurers. We wanted to explore, to immerse ourselves in the culture. But they were content to sit in the hotel and do nothing. If we spent too long outside, they'd call incessantly, pressuring us to come back. Our idea of a vacation didn't match theirs, and I couldn't bear the thought of them tagging along and putting a damper on what should be a special experience. I didn't think we were being unfair. After all, Susan and Nadia had taken their own trips without us. Short ones, yes, but the fact remained. And we were going to India for 10 days. I felt that was more than enough reason to want this experience just for us. So, when my dad reassured me that he would handle Susan and Nadia's feelings later, I felt relief. I packed with joy, ready for the adventure ahead. I couldn't wait. The trip was just around the corner. I was counting down the hours. And then, just hours ago, everything shattered. It's 2 a.m. now, and I'm still reeling from what happened. I was organizing my things when I realized my passport was missing. I searched everywhere. And that's when I found out Susan and Nadia had burned it. They burned my passport. You read that correctly. My father and I just discovered it a few hours ago. I felt a sudden rush of panic as I realized that something was terribly wrong. My passport was missing. The feeling of dread was almost physical as I began turning every corner of the house, searching with frantic urgency. I scoured every drawer, every nook and cranny, flipping through piles of papers and tearing apart rooms. 45 minutes passed, but it was still nowhere to be found. My heart was racing. The walls seemed to close in. Stress gnawed at my nerves until Susan and Nadia entered my room, their faces sweetly innocent, like they were genuinely concerned. "Is there something you're missing?" they asked, their voices laced with too much sweetness. But I could feel something was off, something wasn't right. I wanted to say no, to shut them out, but the desperation for help was stronger than my doubts. "I can't find my passport," I confessed, panic in my voice. "Do you know where it is?" Without a word, Susan tossed something onto my bed. I looked down, only to be met with the most shocking sight, my passport. Or what was left of it. It was burned, charred beyond recognition, its edges singed and crumbling in places. The horror hit me like a tidal wave. My passport, my lifeline to the world, was gone. Destroyed. And for what? There was no way anyone would accept this. I was left speechless, paralyzed by shock. Susan and Nadia stood there, a twisted sense of satisfaction on their faces. They had done this. They had crossed a line that could never be undone. My world went numb. I could feel the sting of betrayal deep in my chest, but I was determined not to let them see my pain. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my tears. I picked up what remained of the passport, shoved it aside, and without a word, slammed the door in their faces. Locked it. And let the tears fall, silently, as my anger boiled beneath the surface. Dad was out, picking up some last-minute shopping. He was preparing for the trip, for the time he and I were going to share. I sent him a message, short, sharp. Susan and Nadia destroyed my passport. Please come home. I attached a picture of the wreckage. Within minutes, I could hear him at the door. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. I knew exactly what he was going to do. I stayed in my room, too angry to face them. When he came back inside, I could hear him in the hallway, his voice rising. He was furious. He was livid. Get out of my house, he shouted, his words like a thunderclap. You don't get to do this to my daughter. He called them out for what they were, psychos. And he was done. From downstairs, I could hear Susan and Nadia trying to play their usual game. Their fake tears. Their lies. It was an accident, they claimed. She left it on the dresser, and a cigarette caught fire. A lie. A blatant lie. My father knew better. He knew I didn't smoke. I couldn't take it any longer. I stormed downstairs, bursting into the scene. My father, his face like stone, was just about to do something that would change everything. What was he planning? I had no idea. But when he reached into his office and pulled out a set of papers, I knew something big was coming. Nadia's face fell immediately, and I felt a chill run through me. I didn't know it at the time, but those papers were her future. They were the documents for a student loan, one my father had planned to co-sign for her. He had seen that she needed help, and he had stepped up. But no more. Not after what they had done to me. He took those papers, ripped them to pieces in front of her, and tossed them aside. The message was clear. What they had done was unforgivable. Susan and Nadia, shocked and begging, tried to fight back. They pleaded with him to change his mind, but he stood firm. He was done. In less than an hour, they were gone from the house. But the messages didn't stop. Nadia in particular. Apologies, please, promises. She was desperate. She wanted my father to co-sign again, to help her with the loan. She tried to justify it, tried to explain why they had burned my passport. They were hurt. They felt left out. I couldn't hold back any longer. I responded to their message. How is it fair, I asked, that you went on so many trips just the two of you, yet I can't have this one thing? My father and I are going to India to honor my mom, and you couldn't even let me have that? Why? I reminded her of the truth. My mom was gone, and this trip was all I had left. You still get to see your dad. I don't even have that anymore. And yet you couldn't let me have this one thing. It felt so unfair, utterly and completely. How could she even think to ask me for help after everything she had done? What she did to me. That was one thing. But what had happened to her? Well, that felt like pure justice. And now, after everything, she still thought she had the right to ask anything from me. Not even forgiveness, because I couldn't offer that. Not anymore. But still, she kept begging, her messages flooding my phone. I tried blocking her, tried shutting it all out, but something, some nagging voice, kept me from doing it. Why? Was it because, deep down, I was questioning if maybe, just maybe, I had been unfair too? Maybe I had overreacted. After all, wasn't it a bit selfish to take this trip without considering Nadia and Susan? They did have a point. They were always the ones stuck with short, weekend trips while we were off to India, a whole 10-day journey. Could I really ignore their feelings? That thought lingered. So, here I was, sitting, pondering, asking myself, was it so wrong to go on this international trip with my dad for my 18th birthday, just the two of us? Before I dive deeper into what happened next, I need to address something that's been on everyone's mind. Why hadn't I gone to college yet? Well, I graduated last year. But I didn't jump right into college. Instead, I decided to take a gap year. A year to figure out my path. A year where I worked, interned, and dabbled in journalism. I got my feet wet, learned a thing or two about the industry I want to enter. I've already started applying to colleges, and Nadia and I were supposed to be in the same class. But unlike me, Nadia didn't have the luxury of a college fund waiting for her. That's why my dad had been willing to co-sign for her student loan. Susan had been worried about the cost, but her father? He didn't think he should help. He felt Nadia should handle it herself. Susan, on the other hand, thought college was stressful enough without having to worry about tuition. But that wasn't my concern. Their financial struggles were theirs to solve. It wasn't until a few days ago that I even learned about those loan documents my dad had torn up in front of Nadia. But let's return to today. The day I was supposed to leave for India, except, well, that was all ruined. Without my passport, the trip was off. So, instead, my dad and I spent the day at home, watching old films we loved, films that, surprisingly, were helping to lift my spirits. I had blocked Nadia and Susan. I realized it was time to stop feeling sorry for them. You were all right. I had been torturing myself for no reason. I'd let my emotions run wild, especially since I'd been missing my mom so much lately. The tears, the frustration, the heartache, it all came rushing back. And let's be honest, it was 2 a.m. Who makes life decisions at 2 in the morning? So, I blocked them, and now, they could beg all they wanted. It wouldn't make a difference. They messed with me for no reason. And now, whatever was happening to them, they totally deserved it. Fast forward 4 days. My dad came home from work today and dropped a bombshell. He'd filed for divorce. We sat down, and we finally had that long overdue conversation. We tried to have it before, the whole family meeting thing, when we discussed how Nadia and Susan's behavior had shifted after my dad married Susan. But, of course, nothing had changed. The tension still hung in the air. Instead of being cruel, they simply stopped acknowledging me, stopped interacting altogether. And I knew that wasn't what family was supposed to be. My dad finally admitted something I had been waiting to hear. He had been selfish. He had been thinking only of himself, only about his own happiness. But now, he realized it wasn't working. It wasn't healthy for any of us. He knew, deep down, that Susan wasn't the right person for him. Maybe he loved her, that was his personal battle, but it was clear she didn't love him enough to treat me with respect, to accept me as his daughter. He told me he'd known, for a while, that something was off. She never liked me. It wasn't just a simple dislike, it was a deeper, more painful resentment. She couldn't bring herself to accept me as part of the family. Was it because she felt like, to my father, I would always come first? A strange sense of rivalry seemed to brew within her, a quiet jealousy and insecurity. Was it because, in her mind, it could never be the three of them, but always my father and me? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. She had never seemed to grasp the fact that I was already part of his life, part of our family. And I think that fear of being overshadowed, of never truly fitting in, drove a wedge between us. My father could never understand the shift in their behavior. The two women who had always been kind to me, the ones who welcomed me with open arms, suddenly turned cold and distant after the marriage. Why? He had tried to overlook it at first. He didn't want to complicate things. But now, it was impossible to ignore. The damage was done. No more pretending. He was tired of the facade, the act of a happy family. And the truth was, there was no happy family. It was all a lie. Now, finally, he was ready to face the truth. He had spoken to his lawyer earlier that day. Divorce papers were signed. The proceedings were about to begin. I'm sorry for everything you've had to endure, he told me. And then, we embraced. Was he a perfect father? No. He had his flaws. He had been selfish at times. But in my heart, I know this, for all the mistakes he made, he did so much right. He was the best father I could have ever asked for. And I love him always. Days passed. I could hear him when he came home that evening, his voice raised in anger, his frustration leaking through the walls. What was happening? I had no answers. All I knew was that something was different. Something had shifted, and I could feel the weight of it in every second of silence that followed. He had been served. The divorce papers were in her hands now, and the battle had begun. He hadn't even spoken to me yet. It made me anxious, wondering what would come next. 5 days since the divorce was filed. 5 days of nothing but silence between me and the two of them. I hadn't heard from Susan or Nadia, and honestly, I didn't expect to. I had blocked them, and they hadn't tried to reach out. Lucky for them, I thought. Had they tried, I would have had a lot to say. A lot. But it didn't matter now. I was still angry. I was still hurt. But India, our long-planned trip, was now delayed. How could it not be? The divorce was still in motion. I couldn't help but wonder when we'd find the time to go. I was starting college soon, and the reality of that was sinking in. But at least the thought of it, the hope that one day soon, we would take that trip, kept me going. Just a little longer. Then came another evening. My father, exhausted from the endless fighting, came out of his office and explained it all. Susan had called. She had threatened him, her voice dripping with venom. She told him that if he went through with the divorce, she would tear him apart with lies. She'd destroy everything he had worked so hard for. She was ruthless. He hadn't expected it, not when he was at work. But he had been prepared this time. This time, he recorded her threats. He told her that if she tried to use this against him, he would make sure she paid. It was intense. The anger in his voice, the tension in the room, she had tried to intimidate him, but he had turned it around. He was done with her. And I could see it. He was finally standing his ground. And so, the proceedings began. The divorce was in motion, and we were one step closer to the future we'd been hoping for. India, our trip, was no longer a distant dream. It was real. It was happening. It had to. Weeks passed, and the divorce was finally finalized. Susan, as expected, got nothing. Nothing at all. She had tried to take so much, child support, assets, you name it, but my father fought back. He wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. Not after everything. And just like that, it was over. No more games. No more lies. I had my passport back. It felt like freedom. I could finally breathe. And now, my father and I are planning our trip to India. It's going to happen. It's real this time. I'm excited. Overwhelmed with happiness. And it feels like everything is finally falling into place. Thank you, everyone, for your support, your kindness, and for sticking with me through it all. This is only the beginning.